It was cold the morning Cletus Trimble drove to Cedar Falls. Not the kind of cold that surprises you, but the kind that has been building for weeks, settling into the ground and the metal and the bones of anyone who has spent enough years working outside. The sky was the color of old concrete. The fields on either side of the highway had been harvested weeks ago and were now just miles of broken stalks standing in frozen mud, waiting for something to cover them. Cletus had been on this road before. He knew exactly how long it took to get from his house in Waverly to the auction grounds outside Cedar Falls, and he had spent that 40 minutes doing what he always did on auction mornings, which was to keep his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road and his mind somewhere else entirely. He was 61 years old. He had a shop behind his house with 3 machines in it that he hadn't finished yet. He had a wife who had been clear with him the night before and clearer still this morning. He had also, before leaving, taken $400 in cash from the box in the kitchen cabinet and folded it into the front pocket of his wallet. Jewel had seen him do it. She was standing at the kitchen counter when he came back through, and she had that particular way of not looking at him that was worse than any direct accusation. He kissed her on the forehead and said he was just going to look. She said nothing. He walked to the door, picked up his jacket from the hook, and then he stopped because she said his name. Not loudly, just his name, and the way she said it was enough to make him turn around. She was looking at him now. Her coffee was in both hands. Her expression was not angry. It was something harder to answer than anger. "I need you to actually hear me this time," she said. "Not hear me and then do what you were going to do anyway. Actually hear me." "I hear you, Jewel. The garage hasn't had room for my car since August. There's a water pump on a piece of plywood in the corner that's been there since June. I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking you to talk to me before you spend money we didn't discuss." He stood there with his jacket in his hand. She was right about the water pump. She was right about the garage. She was right about all of it. "I'll just look," he said again. He watched something shift in her face. Not quite resignation. Something older and more patient than resignation. "Okay, Cletus," she said. She turned back to the counter. He went out to the truck and backed the trailer out of the garage before she could see him doing it. He told himself it was just in case. The auction ground was a 50-acre stretch of muddy farmland north of Cedar Falls, and by the time Cletus pulled in just after 8 in the morning, there were already 40 trucks parked in rough rows across the field. The kind of trucks that spend their whole lives outside. Dented beds, cracked mirrors, mud packed into the wheel wells from the last 3 rainy seasons. Some of them had stock racks in the back. Some had toolboxes that had been bolted on and repainted so many times you couldn't tell what color they started as. Cletus had been to enough of these to know the rhythm. You parked, you got coffee, if there was any worth getting, and then you walked the lots before the bidding started. Not to buy, to look, to try to understand what something was before someone put a price on it. He walked past a grain drill so old the seed tubes had been replaced with rubber hose and electrical tape. He walked past a 2-bottom plow that nobody had touched since probably the late 90s. He walked past a skid steer with a cracked windshield and a hydraulic hose that had been wrapped in duct tape at some point and then forgotten. And then at the far end of the second row, set slightly apart from the other equipment, as if it had been pushed to the edge on purpose, was the Kubota. He noticed the space around it first, not the machine itself, the empty space. At a farm auction, even bad equipment draws people. Even machines with blown engines and cracked blocks have someone circling them, someone crouching down to look underneath, someone opening the hood and frowning and pretending they know something. It is a kind of theater, and it plays out around every lot in every auction across Iowa, every weekend from March to November. This machine had a ring of empty grass around it, a 6-foot circle where nobody was standing. Nobody had kicked the tire. Nobody had lifted the hood. The coffee cups on the nearby tailgates had their backs to it. Cletus walked toward it. It was a 1984 Kubota L 355 SS. The orange paint had faded to something closer to dusty salmon's way old Kubota paint does when it has spent 40 years facing south in Iowa weather. The rear right tire was half flat. A strip of red electrical tape ran diagonally across the steering wheel, the universal farm signal for something that shouldn't be moved. And zip-tied to the throttle lever was a yellow tag, the kind that comes in packs of 50 from the hardware store, and on it someone had written in thick black marker, "Do not start. Hydraulic failure." Cletus looked at the tag, he looked at the flat tire. He looked at the cab glass, which was fogged on the inside with that particular gray-green film you get when a machine has been sitting closed up through an entire season, the kind of condensation that takes months to build. And then he saw the thing that didn't fit. The hood latch was clean, not polished, not new, just cleaner than it should have been on a machine that had apparently been abandoned to rust and weather and irrelevance. Everything else on the tractor was filmed with dust and oxidation. The mirrors were grimy, the seat was stained, but the hood latch had the dull gray look of metal that someone had touched recently, repeatedly. Somebody had been under that hood, and not long ago. Cletus stood there for a while, not touching anything, just looking. He had learned a long time ago that the first few minutes with a machine before you've touched anything or started anything or formed any opinion are the most honest minutes you'll get. After that, you start seeing what you expect to see. He didn't know yet what he was seeing. He just knew it didn't add up. The auctioneer worked his way down the rows with the practiced monotony of a man who has been doing this for 30 years and has made peace with the fact that it is not a glamorous job. When he finally reached the Kubota, he opened at $800 and was greeted by complete silence. He tried $600, still nothing. Someone near the back of the crowd laughed at the $400 opening, a short dismissive laugh that said everything about how the machine was regarded. Cletus raised his hand when the number hit 250. The auctioneer looked around the field for a long moment. Nobody moved. "Sold," he said, and the word landed without ceremony. The man who had consigned the tractor appeared from somewhere near the portable fence at the edge of the lot. He was in his late 40s, wearing a denim jacket that was slightly too thin for the weather, and his eyes had the particular tiredness of someone who has been dealing with something unpleasant for a long time and is relieved to be almost done with it. His name was Myron Dunning. He owned a 40-acre property about 12 miles east, a place he called a hobby farm, with the self-awareness of someone who knows they are not really a farmer. His father had been the farmer. "You should know what you bought," Myron said. Cletus nodded. Myron told him about his father first, briefly, the way people talk about the dead when they are trying to talk about something else. Corbett Dunning had bought the tractor new in 1984 and had run it on those 40 acres for over 30 years. He had died in 2017. Myron had kept the property because selling it felt wrong, but he worked a desk job in Waterloo and had never really known what to do with a tractor. Then about 6 months before the auction, the machine had started losing hydraulic pressure. The loader dropped slowly when it should have held position. The 3-point hitch wouldn't stay up under load. Myron had trailered it 40 miles south to the nearest certified Kubota dealership, a shop with a parts counter and a waiting room and a coffee machine that had not been cleaned since at least 2011. 3 weeks after dropping it off, the diagnostic report came back on dealership letterhead. Myron recited it from memory in the flat voice of someone who has rehearsed the words enough that they have stopped meaning anything. Internal hydraulic pump, failure, transmission, contamination, suspected possible damage to hydrostatic components. Full teardown, recommended estimated repair cost between $32,000 and $48,000 depending on what the teardown revealed. Parts availability on a 1984 model described as limited to unavailable. At the bottom of the report, the service writer had added a note by hand, honestly not worth it. Machine is effectively unrepairable for the money. Myron had paid $1,100 for that diagnosis. He had driven the tractor home, parked it behind the old hay barn, and left it there through the summer. His wife had asked him to have it gone before the first snow. Cletus listened to all of it without interrupting. He had a habit of silence that people sometimes mistook for disinterest. It was the opposite. When he was listening carefully, he went very still. When Myron finished, Cletus asked one question. When they said the pump was gone, did they pull it out and show you? Myron's expression shifted in a way that was hard to read. What do you mean? When the diagnosis came back saying the internal pump had failed, did someone at the shop take the pump out, set it on the counter, and show you what was wrong with it? Myron thought about it. The thinking took longer than it should have. No, he said finally. They said it was internal. They said you could tell from the pressure readings. Cletus nodded slowly. He paid his $250 in cash, hooked his trailer to the Kubota's front axle with the practiced efficiency of someone who has loaded broken equipment in muddy fields more times than he can count. And by noon, the tractor was sitting on the concrete pad behind his shop in Waverly. He went inside for lunch. Jewel had left a sandwich and coffee on the counter without comment. He ate standing at the sink, looking out the back window at the machine on the pad, thinking about the clean hood latch and the one question he had asked Myron and what Myron's answer had told him. He carried his cup to the sink and went out to the shop. That evening, he walked out to the concrete pad with a flashlight, opened the hood, and stood there looking at the engine for a long time. He was not looking for anything specific. He was trying to understand the general shape of things, what had been maintained and what hadn't, what had been touched recently and what had been left alone. The engine was dusty but not corroded. The battery terminals had the white powder of a dead or dying cell. The belts looked original, which was not ideal on a 35-year-old machine, but they had not cracked through. The air filter housing had a small crack in the plastic sealed at some point with black silicone. Someone's fix applied years ago and long forgotten. He stood there for 20 minutes, moving the flashlight slowly across the engine compartment, and then he closed the hood and went back inside. The next morning, he went out before breakfast. The battery was dead as he had expected. He pulled it, carried it into the shop, put it on the charger, and left it overnight. The following morning, he reinstalled it, climbed up into the cab, and turned the key. The starter engaged. The diesel turned over once, twice, and then caught. For the first 15 seconds, the engine ran rough, the uneven idle of a machine that hasn't been started in months and is pulling cold fuel through lines that have been sitting still. Then it smoothed out, and what was left once the initial rough running cleared was a sound that Cletus had not expected. He had expected problems. He had prepared himself for knocking, for surging RPMs, for smoke from the exhaust stack, for the kind of mechanical protest that a machine makes when its internal components are damaged and degraded. A tractor with catastrophic hydraulic pump failure and suspected transmission contamination should sound like something is wrong. It should announce its suffering. This one did not. The idle was steady and low and even. The oil pressure gauge climbed to just above 40 PS1 and held there without wavering. The temperature gauge rose in the normal arc of a cold engine warming to operating temperature. There was no smoke. There was no knock. There was no surge. Cletus stood next to the running engine with one hand resting on the edge of the open hood and listened for 5 full minutes. He listened the way he had learned to listen to machinery, not with diagnostic intent, so much as with an open mind, letting the sounds come without trying to categorize them immediately. What he heard was a tractor that sounded like a tractor. He shut it down and stood in the silence afterward and let that fact settle. A machine with the damage that the dealer's report described should not behave this way. That was not optimism or wishful thinking. It was mechanical logic. Internal pump failure produces noise. Transmission contamination produces symptoms. Hydrostatic damage produces behavior. This machine had produced none of the things it was supposed to produce. He walked into the shop, sat down at the workbench, and opened the spiral notebook he kept for jobs. He wrote 2 words at the top of the first page: runs clean. He drew a question mark underneath. The next morning, Floyd Trumbull came through the fence. Floyd Trumbull was 55 years old and had farmed the property adjacent to Cletus's for the better part of 2 decades. He was the kind of neighbor who appeared without announcement and entered without knocking, not out of rudeness, but out of a habit of proximity that stretched back to when their fence line had been a shared project and a shared conversation. He was a large man with strong opinions and the particular confidence of someone who has been correct about most things for most of his life. He stood in the doorway of the shop and looked at the Kubota on the pad outside. "That's the one from the Cedar Falls auction," he said. "It was not a question." "It is. I was standing right there, Cletus. Nobody bid on it. The dealer said it was finished." "I know what the dealer said." Floyd came fully into the shop and set his coffee cup down on the end of the workbench. He looked at the open notebook. He looked at the 2 words Cletus had written. "It nailed the start this morning," Cletus said. "Ran clean. No knock, no surge, no smoke." Starting doesn't mean the hydraulics aren't shot. "I know that. The dealer has diagnostic equipment, pressure gauges, flow meters, the whole setup. You've got a notebook and a flashlight." Cletus looked at him. "I have one question they didn't ask." "What question?" "Why?" Floyd stared at him. "Why it's broken." "They asked what was broken. Nobody asked why it was broken. Those are 2 completely different questions." Floyd picked up his coffee cup and was quiet for a moment. He looked at the tractor through the shop doorway. It was sitting in the thin October sunlight with its hood still latched and its warning tag still hanging from the throttle lever, and it looked exactly like what everyone at that auction had decided it was a machine that was finished. Floyd said carefully, "You're convincing yourself there's something to find because you already bought it." Cletus said nothing. "I'm not trying to be a hard case," Floyd said. "I'm trying to save you a month of your life." "I appreciate that." Floyd finished his coffee and set the empty cup on the bench. He moved toward the door and then he stopped and looked back at the tractor one more time. It was a long look, not the dismissive glance of a man who has made up his mind, but the measuring look of someone who is still, despite everything, curious. He climbed through the fence and walked back across his field without another word. Cletus watched him go. He noted the second look. A man who was truly done with a subject did not look back. That night, Cletus did not go out to the shop after dinner. He sat at the kitchen table with his notebook closed in front of him and a cup of coffee going cold and thought about what Floyd had said, not the part about the diagnostic equipment, because that was fair but not decisive. The other part, the part about convincing yourself. He was 61 years old. He had been doing this long enough to know the difference between instinct and wishful thinking, and he was not always sure he could tell them apart in real time. He had been wrong before. He had spent money before on machines that turned out to be exactly as dead as advertised. He knew what that felt like. But there was the clean hood latch. There was the sound of the engine at idle. There was Myron's answer about the pump, the pause before it, the fact that 3 weeks of diagnostic work had apparently not included the single most direct step available. He sat there until the coffee was cold, and then he sat there a little longer. Jewel came through the kitchen on her way to the bedroom. She stopped when she saw him. She looked at the closed notebook. She looked at his face. She had been married to him for 31 years, and she had developed a reading of his silences that was more accurate than most people's direct communication. She went to the counter and came back with the coffee pot. She refilled his cup without being asked. She sat down across from him. "You're not sure," she said. "I'm not sure of anything yet." "What did Floyd say?" "He said I might be convincing myself." "Do you think he's right?" Cletus looked down at the notebook. He turned it over so he wasn't looking at the cover. "I think he might be. I also think there's something wrong with that diagnosis that isn't just me wanting to be right." Jewel was quiet for another moment. Then she said something that surprised him. "Things that have been neglected don't always look like what they actually are. Sometimes they look like something much worse." He looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the window at the dark outside, at nothing in particular. "That's what you're thinking," she said. "That someone looked at what it had become and decided that was all it ever was." He didn't answer because she had said it more precisely than he had been able to say it to himself. She stood up and put her hand on his shoulder for one moment as she passed. She went to bed without asking anything more of him. Cletus sat at the table for another hour. Then he got up, pulled on his jacket, and went out to the shop. He stood in front of the Kubota in the dark with a flashlight and looked at the clean hood latch for a long time. Before he went back inside, he stood in the doorway of the shop for a moment, looking at the machine in the dark. There was no reason to feel anything in particular about a 35-year-old tractor that might or might not be repairable. It was just a machine. It had no history that belonged to him, no significance beyond the $250 he had spent and the question he could not stop turning over. But standing in that doorway in the cold October dark, Cletus Trimble had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling that he was looking at something that had been misread. Not broken. Misread. He went inside and left the light on in the shop. Jewel had left a cup of coffee on the back step still warm inside the ceramic. He found it when he went back for his flashlight. He stood there in the cold for a moment, holding the cup, looking at the line of light under the shop door. It was not forgiveness. It was not an answer to any of the questions between them. But it was something. Cletus did not open the hydraulic system on the first day, or the second, or the third. He ran the machine instead. Every morning he went out before breakfast, started the engine and let it warm to operating temperature, while he stood next to it with a clipboard and a cup of coffee and paid attention. Not to anything specific, to everything at once. He had learned this from a man named Gerald Prentice, who had run the implement dealer in Waverly for 30 years before retiring, a man who had told him once that the first thing you do with a machine you don't understand is nothing. You watch it. You let it show you what it knows before you start asking questions it isn't ready to answer. The loader went up slowly. Not catastrophically slowly, not the labored inch-by-inch creep of a system with no pressure at all, but slower than it should have been, slower than the hydraulics on a healthy machine respond. When he lowered it, the speed was normal. That asymmetry meant something. The three-point hitch climbed about 8 inches and then stopped. It didn't fail dramatically. It just reached a point where the demand exceeded what the system could supply, and it stalled there, humming with effort, not going further. When he released the control and let it drop, it fell immediately like dead weight, gravity doing the work that hydraulic pressure had been unable to sustain. The reverse gear hesitated, not long, half a second, maybe slightly more. The kind of delay that would be easy to explain away as driver error or cold morning stiffness, except that it was consistent. Every time. The same half beat of nothing before the clutch engaged. He wrote all of it down. On the 4th day, he went back through his notes from the first 3 days and read them in sequence the way you read something when you are looking for the shape of it rather than the individual words. What he saw was a pattern. Every symptom was real. Every symptom was also small. The loader was slow but functional. The hitch stalled but recovered. The reverse hesitated but engaged. There was nothing here that matched the language of the diagnostic report, the language of failure and contamination and irreparable damage. There was only a machine that was doing its work imperfectly, the way something does its work when one of its inputs has been wrong for a long time. He wrote in the notebook, "Not dead, compensating." On the fifth day, he pulled the dipstick. The hydraulic fluid reservoir on the L355SS sat at the rear of the transmission, and the dipstick was a simple steel rod with a looped handle, the kind of component that requires no tools and no mechanical knowledge to check the kind of thing that should be examined before any other diagnostic step on a machine reporting hydraulic problems. The level was low, a quarter-inch below the full mark. Not empty, not dramatically depleted, just slightly insufficient. And that alone was a problem with the diagnosis he had been given, because a machine with a failed internal pump pushes fluid somewhere. It goes into the transmission case or out through a seal onto the ground, or in the worst cases into the engine oil. But the ground under the tractor was dry. The transmission oil, when he checked it with a separate dipstick, was clean. The engine oil was the right color. The fluid was not gone. It was just slightly less than it should have been. He held the dipstick up to the window and looked at the fluid in the light. Kubota Super UDET 2. The fluid these machines are engineered to use has a color and a clarity that are specific and recognizable. It is a deep, clean amber, the way strong tea looks when you hold it up to sunlight. It is made to do several things at once inside a machine like this: to lubricate the hydraulic pump, to act as the medium through which hydraulic pressure is transmitted, and to provide the specific friction characteristics that the wet clutches in the transmission require to engage and release correctly. The fluid on Cletus's dipstick was not that color. It was brownish green and slightly opaque, and when he wiped it between his thumb and forefinger, the texture was wrong. Thicker than it should have been cold. Tacky in a way that hydraulic fluid should not be tacky. He wrote in the notebook, "Fluid wrong color, wrong feel, not UDT." He did not yet know what it meant, but he knew it meant something. The filter came off the next morning. The hydraulic filter on the L355SS is a spin-on canister mounted to the side of the transmission, housing accessible without removing anything else, the kind of component that takes 4 minutes to change and should be changed on a regular schedule that the service records of a well-maintained machine will show repeated in a consistent pattern across the years. Cletus unscrewed it slowly, holding a clean glass jar below the fitting to catch what drained out. The jar had been a pickle jar before he cleaned it and put it on the shelf for exactly this kind of work. He held it up to the fluorescent light of the shop and turned it slowly. The fluid was nearly black. There was a faint greenish cast to it when the light hit it at a certain angle, and suspended in the fluid, visible when he swirled the jar gently, were small, bright particles that farmers call glitter. Not because they are decorative, but because that is exactly what they look like. Metallic fines, the natural wear product of metal moving against metal, fine enough that they do not feel gritty between your fingers, present in small amounts in any used hydraulic fluid, present in larger amounts in fluid that has been working harder than it was designed to work. He poured the contents of the jar through a coffee filter set in a funnel. When the fluid had drained through, he unfolded the filter and examined what remained. The metallic fines were expected, the other material was not. There was something softer mixed in with the metal, a brownish, slightly fibrous residue that smeared when he rubbed it rather than crumbling or dispersing. It was not a large amount, but it was there, and it was not metal, and it was not supposed to be there. He sat down on the concrete floor of the shop with the coffee filter in one hand and the pickle jar in the other. He had been a farmer. and then a fixer of farm equipment for most of his adult life, and he had developed a tolerance for uncertainty that most people in more predictable professions never need to develop. But sitting on the floor of his shop that afternoon, he said out loud to the empty room that he did not know what he was looking at. The machine ran clean, the fluid was wrong, the filter had metal and something else. The symptoms were real but small. The dealer's report said the whole machine was finished. None of these things pointed cleanly in a single direction. He wrote in the notebook, "Something here doesn't add up." He would write that phrase 3 more times before he found the answer. That evening, Cletus called the dealership. The number was on the diagnostic report that Myron had described, printed at the top of the letterhead with the dealership's name and address. Myron had scanned and emailed it before the auction, and Cletus had the copy in front of him. The man who answered was Norbert Kindred, the lead technician, professional, and slightly guarded in the way of someone who handles customer service calls that occasionally go sideways. When Cletus explained who he was and why he was calling, there was a pause, not long, but present. "I'm calling about the L355SS you diagnosed in the spring," Cletus said. "The Dunning machine. I remember it. In the diagnostic report, you listed internal pump failure as the primary finding. When you were diagnosing the hydraulic system, did you remove the filter and examine the contents?" The pause this time was longer. "Our standard diagnostic protocol involves pressure testing at multiple points in the system," Norbert said. "When the readings fall outside of operational parameters on a machine of that age, a full teardown recommendation is the appropriate next step." "I understand the recommendation. I'm asking about the filter." "Removing and examining the filter isn't part of the standard diagnostic protocol at the pressure testing stage." Cletus looked at the copy of the report on his workbench. $32,000 to $48,000. Effectively unrepairable for the money. "Thank you," he said. He hung up and sat with the phone on the bench and looked at the report for a long time. Norbert Kindred had not been dishonest. The pressure readings were real. The numbers had genuinely fallen outside of specification, and on a machine that old with readings that low, a teardown recommendation was not an unreasonable conclusion. He had followed a protocol, and the protocol had led him to the most expensive, plausible explanation for the numbers he had measured. Nobody had pulled the filter. Nobody had looked at the fluid. Nobody had asked what was in the system before they started measuring what the system could do. Cletus wrote in the notebook, they measured the result. They never looked for the cause. The 7th day was the day Cletus almost stopped. Floyd Trumbull came through the fence in the middle of the afternoon with a folded newspaper page in his hand and the look of a man who has prepared an argument. He set the newspaper on the workbench. It was a page from the Iowa Farmer Today, a brief article about the used equipment market with a sidebar that listed approximate values for various compact utility tractors by make and year and condition. "Running L355SS in good condition," Floyd said, pointing to a line in the sidebar. $1,800 to $2,400, that's the market. Cletus looked at the numbers. "You spent $250 at auction. You'll spend more on parts however this goes, and you don't know yet that it's fixable." Floyd's voice was not unkind. "Even if you're right about everything, you're working for a few $100s of margin. A month of your time." Cletus looked at the newspaper. Then he looked at the tractor on the pad outside the shop door. Then he looked back at the newspaper. "I know what the numbers are," he said. "Then what are you doing?" Cletus did not answer right away. It was a fair question, and he had been asking himself a version of it for the past 2 days. "I don't know anymore," he said. Floyd looked at him. It was the most honest thing Cletus had said out loud since he had brought the machine home, and Floyd recognized it as such. He did not push further. He picked up the newspaper, folded it, and put it in his back pocket. "I'll see you tomorrow," Floyd said. He went back through the fence. Cletus stood in the shop for a while after Floyd left. The afternoon light was coming through the west window at a low angle, the particular slant of October light in Iowa that makes everything look like it is already in the past. He stood there and looked at the tractor and felt for the first time since Cedar Falls something close to doubt. He did not go out to the shop after dinner that night. He sat at the kitchen table with the notebook closed and his coffee untouched, and Jewel found him there when she came downstairs for a glass of water at 10 o'clock. She looked at his face and then at the closed notebook and then at his face again. She sat down. "You're thinking about quitting," she said. "I'm thinking about whether I've been wrong this whole time." Jewel was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Have you found anything that proves you're wrong?" "No, I found things that don't fit the diagnosis. But not finding evidence against it isn't the same as finding evidence for it." She looked at him steadily. "Cletus, you've been at this for a week. You've been more careful about this than you are about most things. If you were just convincing yourself, you'd have stopped looking at the evidence 3 days ago." He turned the notebook over in his hands. "Whatever's in that machine," Jewel said, "you haven't found it yet. That's different from it not being there." He was quiet for a long time. "Go look under the seat," she said. He looked at her. "I don't know why," she said. "It just seems like the kind of thing you haven't done yet. Sometimes the obvious thing is the thing nobody does." He sat there for another moment. Then he got up, pulled on his jacket, and went out. The cab of the L355 SS was small. This way cabs on compact utility tractors from the early 80s are small, designed for function rather than comfort, with a seat that sat directly above the rear axle housing and a floor pan that accumulated decades of mud and oil and the general residue of working life. The seat was bolted to a bracket that was bolted to the rear fender. 2 bolts on each side, nothing complicated. Cletus had a 3/8 drive ratchet in his hand. He backed out the first bolt on the left side, then the right, then the second set. He lifted the seat and set it to one side. The floor pan was dirty as expected. He had come out with a flashlight and a rag intending to clean, intending to do something practical and physical, because sometimes that was how you got through the hours when you did not know what else to do. But between the seat bracket and the rear fender, in the space that the seat had been covering, there was a metal box. It was small, the kind of fireproof lockbox you could buy at any hardware store for about $12, the kind with a handle on top and a latch on the front and a lock that most people never bother to use. This one was not locked. It was held in place against the fender by a strip of silver duct tape, and the duct tape had lost most of its adhesion over what had clearly been many years one corner of it, drooping down and curling slightly at the edge. Cletus picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. He stood in the cab of the tractor for a moment with the box in both hands and understood something very clearly. To reach this box, you had to remove the seat. There was no other way to access the space where it sat, which meant that the dealership in 3 weeks of diagnostic work had never found it. The box had been here for years, maybe many years, sitting under the weight of whoever was operating the machine, invisible to anyone who had not removed the seat and looked. He carried it into the shop and set it on the workbench under the fluorescent light. He opened the latch. Inside, folded and bundled and secured with rubber bands that had dried and cracked with age, were papers. Service records, receipts, handwritten notes. He took the first bundle and unfolded the top sheet carefully, the way you handle something old. The paper was dated March of 1985. A dealer stamp in the upper left corner. Service at 50 hours, it read. Oil and filter change. Hydraulic fluid level check. Belt inspection. At the bottom, in a careful looping cursive that had the quality of someone who had learned penmanship at a time when penmanship was taught as a discipline, C. Dunning. Cletus stood very still. Dunning. The same name Myron had given him at the auction. The same family. He began to understand what he was holding. He spread the records across the workbench in chronological order, working through each bundle, reading every receipt and every note. It took more than an hour. Outside the shop, the October night was completely dark and completely quiet. In the way that rural Iowa nights are quiet, the absence of ambient noise so complete that you can hear your own breathing. For the first 20 years from 1985 through the middle of 2005, the records told the story of a machine that had been cared for with a consistency that bordered on devotion. Oil changes every 100 hours documented to the hour. Hydraulic fluid changes every 400 hours, every one of them recorded. Filters replaced on schedule belts, inspected every service item checked and initialed. Every receipt from the same dealership, the same dealer stamp, in the same corner, the same form. And in the margins of the receipts, notes. Not official notes, personal ones. The weather on the day of the service. What work the tractor had been doing in the weeks before. An observation about how the engine was running, whether anything sounded different, what had been adjusted, and what had been left alone. The handwriting was consistent across 2 decades. The same careful cursive. C. Dunning, Corbett Dunning. A man who had kept records the way some people keep journals, not because anyone required it, but because the act of recording was itself a form of care. Then in a receipt from early 2006, the handwriting changed. A different hand, quicker, less deliberate, the writing of someone who was doing this because it needed to be done rather than because they found meaning in doing it carefully. M. Dunning, Myron. The oil change interval stretched from every 100 hours to every 200, then to every 300. The notes in the margins became shorter and then disappeared. The hydraulic fluid changes, which Corbett had performed every 400 hours without exception, stopped appearing in the records entirely after 2009. And then in a receipt from the late summer of 2011, Cletus found it. The note was in Myron's handwriting, the same quick functional script that had been appearing in the records since 2006. It said, topped off hydraulic, used what was in the shed. No UDT at TSC out of stock. Will replace next service. Cletus read it twice. He set the receipt down on the workbench and stood back from it as if distance might help him see it differently. It did not. The wrong fluid had been in this machine since the summer of 2011, 8 years before Cletus bought it at an auction for $250 because nobody else would have it. 8 years of a hydraulic system designed to run on a specific fluid engineered for the particular demands of a wet clutch transmission, running instead on whatever had been available in a storage shed on a day when the farm supply store was out of stock. The soft, fibrous material he had found in the coffee filter was not clutch material. It was the wrong fluid itself, broken down by years of heat cycling into a residue that coated the passages in the valve seats and the suction screen. The metallic glitter was real but minor, the wear that accumulates when the lubricant is perpetually insufficient. The relief valve that was sticking, causing the 3-point hitch to stall at mid-stroke, was sticking because of that accumulated residue on the valve seat. The loader's slow lift and the reverse hesitation traced back to the same root. None of it was a blown pump. None of it was transmission failure. All of it was one note. One afternoon in 2011, a man trying to get his hay in before a storm came through, finding the farm supply store out of the fluid he needed, using something that was available, writing himself a reminder to fix it at the next service. The next service had never come. Cletus sat down on the floor of the shop with the receipt in his hand. He was still sitting there when he heard the side door of the shop open. Jewel came in wearing her coat over her pajamas, her hair down, carrying 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. She looked at him on the floor and did not say anything about it. She sat down in the wooden shop chair and set one of the sandwiches on the workbench within his reach. Cletus got up from the floor and sat on the stool. "I found it," he said. He told her everything: the box, the records, Corbett's handwriting across 20 years of careful maintenance, the shift in 2006, the note from 2011. Jewel listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the workbench and picked up the 2011 receipt. She read it. She set it down. "He was trying to take care of it," she said. Myron. Yes, he didn't know how his father knew how, but he was trying. Cletus looked at the receipt. And then one day he was in a hurry, and the store was out of the right thing, and he used what was available, and he told himself he'd fix it. And he didn't. And 8 years later, it looks like the whole machine is gone. Jewel was quiet for a long time. The shop was warm from the space heater in the corner, and outside the night was cold and still, and the fluorescent lights hummed the way fluorescent lights always hum when everything else is quiet. "You know what I keep thinking about," Jewel said. He waited. "I keep thinking about Corbett." She looked at the spread of records on the workbench. He kept all of this. Every receipt, every note, everything. He put it in a box and hid it under the seat. She paused. He knew someone would come after him. He didn't know who. He didn't know when. He just knew that whoever it was would need to know how to take care of it. So he left them the instructions. Cletus looked at the records. He was trying to protect it, Jewel said, even after he couldn't protect it himself. He did not say anything because there was nothing to add. Jewel stood up and put her hand on his arm for a moment. "Fix it," she said, "and then call Myron." She went back to the house. Cletus sat alone in the shop with the records spread around him under the humming fluorescent light in the quiet of the Iowa night. He picked up the 2011 receipt one more time. He looked at Myron's handwriting. "Will replace next service." He put it back with the others, straightened the bundles, and returned them carefully to the box. Then he opened the notebook and began to write. Cletus began the repair on a Monday. He did not rush into it. He stood at the workbench for a while. First, the notebook opened to a fresh page and wrote down everything he intended to do and in what order. This was a habit he had developed over years of working alone, because alone there was nobody to catch the mistake you made when you skipped a step or got ahead of yourself. The list was not complicated, but writing it made it real, and making it real meant committing to the belief that what he had found in that lockbox under the seat was the actual story of this machine, and not just the part of the story that felt good to believe. He started with the drain. The hydraulic reservoir sat on the left side of the transmission housing, and when Cletus removed the drain plug and held the collection pan underneath, what came out looked nothing like fluid that belonged in a machine. It was dark and slow-moving, and it caught the fluorescent light of the shop in a way that healthy oil does not, with a faint iridescent sheen on the surface that spoke of chemical breakdown and oxidation, and years of heat cycling that the fluid had never been designed to survive. He watched it drain into the pan and thought about Myron writing that note in 2011. No UDT at the farm supply store. Something in the shed. A promise to replace it at the next service. The next service had been 9 years ago, and it had never come. He drained the transmission case next, then the filter housing, then cracked the fittings on the loader lines and the three-point hitch lines, and let everything that was in the system work its way out into collection pans that he had lined up across the shop floor. When all of it was out, he stood back and looked at what 9 years of the wrong fluid looked like. When it was no longer hidden inside the machine, it had been slowly degrading. It was not a dramatic sight. That was the thing that stayed with him. It was just dark fluid in metal pans. It did not announce itself. It had been inside that tractor for nearly a decade, doing quiet damage, in the way that neglected things do their damage. not all at once, but in the accumulation of small insufficiencies, each one too minor to notice all of them, together enough to produce something that looked from the outside like catastrophe. Marvin Satterfield showed up around 9 in the morning, coming through the side door of the shop without knocking, the way he had been doing for years. He looked at the collection pans on the floor and at the tractor with its lines disconnected, and he pulled the second shop stool out from under the workbench and sat down. "You started," he said. "Yesterday was the planning day." Marvin looked at the pans. He was 62 years old and had spent 20 years as a diesel mechanic before his knees made the work impossible, and he had come back to farming because at least farming let you sit down sometimes. He had seen fluid that looked like this before. Not often, but enough. "A W46? He asked. "My best guess could be W32, whatever was in the shed in 2011. Marvin nodded slowly. He looked at the tractor the way mechanics look at machines that have been mistreated with something that is not quite pity, but is close to it. "The pump. Still in. I want to flush the system before I pull anything." "Smart." He picked up the notebook from the workbench and read through the service plan Cletus had written that morning. He read it twice, which Cletus took as a sign of respect. Marvin was not a man who read things twice out of politeness. "You're going to change that filter 3 times, Marvin said. "At least. Most people would do it once. Most people aren't trying to get 9 years of breakdown product out of a system that's never been flushed." Marvin set the notebook down. He did not offer to help, and Cletus did not ask him to. They had known each other long enough to understand that the offer would be declined, and that declining it was not rudeness. Cletus worked alone. It was not a preference so much as a requirement of the way he thought, which was linearly and without interruption. But Marvin stayed for an hour sitting on the stool and talking about other things the way men do when they want to be present without being in the way. He talked about the price of corn and a fence repair Floyd had been putting off, and a grandchild who had just started walking. Cletus listened and worked, and the conversation was its own kind of company. Before he left, Marvin said, "You know the dealer wasn't wrong about what he measured." "I know that. He measured real numbers. The pressure really was low. He just didn't ask the next question." "No," Cletus agreed, "he didn't." Marvin stood up from the stool and stretched his back with the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned the consequences of moving too quickly. "The next question was cheap," he said. "That's the part that'll stay with you." He went out through the side door and the shop was quiet again. The first flush took most of the afternoon. Cletus put a cheap hydraulic flushing fluid into the system, ran the machine at low load for 20 minutes, cycling the loader and the hitch slowly, then drained it again. What came out was darker than the flushing fluid he had put in, which meant the flush was working, which meant there was still material in the system that needed to come out. He changed the filter after the first flush, cut it open over a clean piece of cardboard, the way he always did with first filters on a neglected machine, and confirmed what the coffee filter had already shown him 2 weeks earlier. He put the new filter on and started the second flush. On the third day, Cletus pulled the hydraulic pump. He was not expecting to find damage, but he needed to see the pump directly because there was a version of himself that would always wonder if he had been too quick to believe the story he wanted to believe. The only way to answer that version of himself was to take the pump apart and look. He disassembled it on a clean towel on the workbench, working slowly and methodically, setting each component down in order so that reassembly would not require guesswork. He picked up the set of calipers from the end of the workbench. They were his father's, bought at a Sears in Des Moines in 1971, the handles worn smooth from decades of use. He measured each vane against the manufacturer's specification. The housing bore the rotor. Everything was within spec, not new, not fresh. The surfaces showed the kind of wear that 40 years of work produces: a dulling of the machine finish, a slight polishing of the contact surfaces. The pump was tired after 4 decades of continuous use, but it was not damaged. It had always been fine. Cletus set the calipers down and wrote in the notebook, "Pump within spec. Tired but fine." He put the pump back together and reinstalled it. On the afternoon of the 7th day, Floyd Trumbull came back. He did not come alone. He brought Marvin Satterfield, which meant he had called Marvin first, which meant Floyd had been thinking about this more than he had let on. He came through the shop door while Cletus was connecting the last of the hydraulic lines, and he stood there with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral, in the way of a man who has an opinion but has decided to wait for evidence before delivering it. Marvin had a hydraulic pressure gauge set in a soft case that he set on the workbench without ceremony. "Figured we'd get a real number," he said. Cletus did not object. A witness result was worth more than a solitary one, and he knew that Floyd needed to see the gauge with his own eyes. It took another hour to fill the system. 12 gallons of genuine Kubota Super UDT, 2 purchased from a dealership in Waterloo the previous day. Not the same dealership that had written the diagnostic report. Cletus had driven the extra 30 miles deliberately. He poured the last of it in, slowly watching the level, climb to the correct mark, then replace the cap and climb down from the tractor. "Ready," Cletus said. Marvin connected his pressure gauge to the main hydraulic line. Floyd moved around to the side of the tractor where he could see both the gauge and the loader arms. He had uncrossed his arms at some point without appearing to notice. Cletus climbed into the cab. He turned the key. The engine caught on the second crank and settled into its low idle. He let it warm for 3 minutes, watching the temperature gauge, feeling the familiar patience of a man who has waited for machines to reach operating temperature thousands of times and has never once found a shortcut worth taking. Then he put his hand on the loader control and raised it. The loader arms came up, not slowly, not with the labored hesitation of a system working against itself. They came up at full travel speed, smooth and immediate, and certain the way hydraulics are supposed to work, when every component in the system is doing what it was designed to do. Marvin looked at the gauge. He looked at Cletus through the cab window. He looked at the gauge again. "It's in the green," he said, "dead center of the operating range." Cletus raised the 3-point hitch next. It climbed to full height without pausing, without the mid-stroke stall that had been one of the first symptoms he had documented in the notebook 3 weeks ago. He engaged the PTO. It spun up cleanly. He selected reverse and let the clutch out, and the tractor moved backward without any hesitation at all, immediate and responsive, as if the half-second delay had never existed. He shut the engine down and climbed out of the cab. Floyd Trumbull was standing at the front of the tractor with his arms at his sides and an expression on his face that Cletus had never seen there before. Floyd was not a man who was often caught without something to say. He was standing in the kind of silence that comes when the thing you were certain about turns out to be wrong, and you are honest enough to face that directly. "I owe you an apology," Floyd said. Cletus shook his head. "You were protecting me from myself. That's not something you apologize for. I told you to quit. You told me to be careful. There's a difference." Floyd looked at the tractor for a long moment. Then he looked at Marvin. Then something in his face shifted, the particular shift of a man who has just filed a piece of information away in the place where he keeps the things that change how he sees the world. $250, Floyd said. Plus parts, $287. Floyd did the arithmetic without being asked. $537 total. Yes. The three of them stood in the shop in the quiet that follows the resolution of something that has been uncertain for a long time. Marvin disconnected his pressure gauge and coiled the hose back into the soft case. He did it slowly, taking more time than the task required, and Cletus understood that this was Marvin's way of giving the moment its proper weight. That evening, Cletus sat at the kitchen table with the notebook and wrote the final entry for the job. Parts cost, labor hours, total investment. The gap between what this repair had actually required and what the dealership had quoted was not a rounding error or a difference of opinion. It was the distance between two completely different ways of asking questions. Jewel came into the kitchen and looked over his shoulder at the numbers. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you going to call him?" Cletus looked up. "Myron," she said. "Are you going to call him before you sell it?" "Yes," Cletus said. "Tonight." He called Myron Dunning after dinner. Myron picked up on the third ring with the slightly guarded tone of someone who does not recognize the number and has learned to be cautious. When Cletus said his name and explained who he was, there was a pause and then Myron's voice changed. "You found something," Myron said. It was not a question. "I did." Cletus told him everything in the order it had happened. The clean hood latch that had first caught his attention at the auction. The engine that started clean and ran without symptoms. The fluid that was the wrong color and the wrong consistency. The filter and what it had contained. The lockbox under the seat, the one that could only be reached by removing the seat entirely, the one that the dealership had never found because nobody had removed the seat. He told Myron about the service records, about 35 years of his father's handwriting, the same careful cursive in the same margins from 1985 to 2005, the discipline of a man who treated the machine the way you treat something you intend to keep forever. About the point in 2006 where the handwriting changed. About the note from 2011. Myron was quiet for a long time after Cletus stopped speaking. "That was my handwriting," Myron said finally. His voice was different now, quieter. "I don't even remember writing it. I was trying to get the hay in before a storm came through. The farm supply store was out of the UDT. I used whatever hydraulic oil was in the storage shed and told myself I'd fix it at the next service." "I know," Cletus said. "The next service never happened." "No." Myron went quiet again. When he spoke, his voice had the particular flatness of someone who is processing something that they cannot process all at once. How much to fix it? 287 in parts. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Cletus checked the phone to make sure the call was still connected. "I want to offer it back to you," Cletus said. "For what I put into it, that's all." Myron took a long time to answer. When he did, his voice had changed again, and Cletus could hear that he was working to keep it steady. "No, I don't think I can do that. There are too many things attached to it." A pause. "You understand what I mean?" "I do. My father spent 35 years taking care of that machine. He kept every record. He put every receipt in a box and hid it under the seat, so whoever came next would know what it needed." His voice caught slightly and then recovered. "I didn't take care of it the way he took care of it. I tried, but I didn't know how, and then I didn't have time, and then it became the thing I hadn't dealt with. And then it sat behind the barn for a whole summer while I told myself I'd figure it out." Cletus said nothing. There was nothing to say that would improve on Myron's own understanding of what had happened, and saying less was the right thing here. "Can you sell it to someone who will use it?" Myron asked. "Someone who will actually put it to work. I'll find the right person. And tell them about my father. Tell them where those records came from. I want someone to know that he took care of it, that it was taken care of for a long time." "I'll tell him," Cletus said. After he hung up, he sat at the kitchen table for a while. Jewel was in the living room. He could hear the television. He sat with the phone in his hand and thought about Corbett Dunning, who had kept every receipt from every service for 3 decades and stored them in a $12 lockbox under the seat of his tractor so that whoever came after him would have the information they needed to keep the machine running. He thought about what Jewel had said the night they had sat in the shop together with the records spread between them. That Corbett had been trying to protect what he loved even after he was no longer there to protect it himself. He thought about Myron, who had written a note on a piece of paper in 2011 and promised himself he would fix it later, and who had carried that unfinished promise for 9 years without being able to name exactly what it was. He thought about Norbert Kindred at the dealership, who had measured real pressure and arrived at real numbers and made a real recommendation based on what the equipment told him, who had not been dishonest, who had simply stopped one question short of the truth. He wrote in the notebook one last time, not broken, misread. He put the notebook on the shelf above the workbench. 6 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in early December, when the first real snow of the season was threatening from the northwest but had not yet arrived, a couple drove up the lane to Cletus's shop in a truck that was 2 years old and recently washed, the kind of truck that belongs to someone who takes care of things but has not yet been worn down by enough hard seasons to stop trying. Truett Cornwell was 29, broad through the shoulders with a handshake that was firm, without being performative, and eyes that moved around the shop with the attentive look of someone who is interested in how things work. His wife Odie was 27, quieter, with the kind of careful attention that notices details other people walk past. They were building a market garden about an hour north of Waverly near Charles City, and they had been looking for a compact utility tractor for 3 months. Someone in their farming network had given them Cletus's number without explaining much, just saying that he was honest and that his prices were fair. Cletus showed them the machine. He started it, let them hear the idle let Truett operate the loader and the three-point hitch. He watched their faces as the loader came up clean and fast and certain. "It runs well," Truett said. "It does," Cletus agreed. "What's the asking price?" $2,200. "But before we talk about that, I need to tell you what this machine is." He told them everything. He told them about the auction in Cedar Falls and the warning tag on the throttle lever and the ring of empty space that had made him walk over in the first place. He told them about the diagnostic report and the $48,000 estimate and the question he had asked Myron about whether anyone had actually removed the pump. He told them about the 8 days of observation and the fluid that was the wrong color and the filter and the coffee filter, and sitting on the floor of the shop not knowing what he was looking at. He told them about the seat. He told them about Corbett Dunning and 35 years of careful handwriting in the margins of service receipts about oil changes every 100 hours and hydraulic fluid changes every 400 hours, in a discipline that had kept this machine running well for 2 decades. He told them about the handwriting changing in 2006, about the note from 2011, about Myron on the phone, his voice careful and quiet, asking Cletus to tell whoever came next about his father. Odie had not said much during the whole telling of it. She had been standing near the front of the tractor with one hand resting on the hood, the way she had been standing since Cletus started the engine. When he finished, she was still standing that way. "The records," she said. "The box, do you still have it?" "I do. We wanted to go with the machine." Cletus looked at her for a moment. Then he went into the shop and came back with the metal lockbox. He had cleaned it after the repair, wiped it down, replaced the drooping strip of duct tape with a fresh one. He had kept the records inside in their original rubber-banded bundles in the order he had found them, including the note from 2011. He held it out to Odie, and she took it with both hands. Truett wrote the check without negotiating. $2,200, which was a fair price for a running L355 SS in the condition this one was in, and both of them knew it. He tore it out of the checkbook and handed it to Cletus, and Cletus folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket. They loaded the tractor onto their trailer with the efficiency of people who have loaded equipment before and know how to work together without unnecessary direction. Odie secured the chains while Truett walked the ramps, and they did it in about the time it takes to do it right the first time. Before they got back in the truck, Odie turned around. She was holding the lockbox against her chest with both arms. "We'll take care of it," she said. It was a simple thing to say, and she said it simply without drama or performance, The way you say something true that doesn't require decoration. Cletus nodded. He and Jewel stood on the edge of the concrete pad and watched the truck pull out of the drive and turn north on the county road. The snow that had been threatening all morning was beginning now, light and tentative, the kind that doesn't sting at first, but means business by afternoon. The tail lights of the Cornwell's truck disappeared around the curve, and then the lane was empty, and the only mark of the Kubota's presence was a small patch of fresh oil on the concrete where the drain plug had wept slightly during the flush, and Cletus hadn't quite gotten every trace of it. Jewel slipped her hand into his. They stood there for a moment in the quiet, in the light snow, looking at nothing in particular. She asked about the box, Jewel said. She did. That's how you know. Cletus looked at the oil stain on the concrete, small and dark and already dusting over with snow. In a few months, it would be gone entirely, worn away by weather and time, and there would be no sign that anything had stood in that spot at all. Corbett kept those records for 35 years, Cletus said. He kept them so that whoever came next would know what the machine needed. He hid them where they'd be found by someone who was paying attention. Jewel was quiet. But Myron paid $1,100 for a diagnosis that told him to give up, Cletus said, because nobody paid attention to the right things. Nobody asked the right question. He paused. And yet Corbett kept the records anyway. He couldn't know who would find them or when. He just kept them. The snow was coming a little harder now. Jewel turned up the collar of her jacket. I've been thinking, she said, about what I said to you that morning before you left for the auction, about talking to me first. I remember. I meant it. I still mean it. She paused. But I also think that some things you find you can only find because you were looking, and you were always going to go looking. That's who you are. He looked at her. Just talk to me first next time, she said. That's all I'm asking. Not permission, just a conversation. Okay, Jewel. I mean it this time. I know you do. She squeezed his hand once and then let go and walked back toward the house. He watched her go. At the door, she turned back and said something about lunch, a practical thing, a normal thing, and he said he'd be in shortly. He stood on the concrete pad alone for another minute. He was not a philosophical man by nature, or at least he would not have described himself that way. He was a man who fixed things. He had learned to fix things because on a dairy farm in Iowa in the 1980s, you either learned or you hired someone, and hiring someone meant the repair waited and the waiting cost you. He had fixed things because the alternative was worse, and over time, the habit of repair had become something he could not fully separate from the habit of paying attention. What the Kubota had taught him, if it had taught him anything, was not a lesson about hydraulic systems or fluid specifications or the limits of diagnostic equipment. Those were just the mechanism. The lesson was older and simpler and had nothing specific to do with tractors. Most things that appear broken are not broken the way they appear to be broken. The visible damage is usually the last chapter of a much longer story, and the story almost always begins with something small, something done once in a hurry because the right answer was not available that day. Something that seemed manageable at the time, a temporary fix, a deferred service, a note written on a receipt with every intention of following through. No UDT at the farm supply store. Something in the shed. Will replace next service. The next service had never come. Not because Myron was careless or indifferent, but because life moves fast, and the things we mean to fix have a way of getting buried under the things that are more urgent. And by the time we look again, the small thing has become something that looks like it was always large. Cletus looked at the snow settling on the empty concrete pad where the tractor had stood. That was the whole difference, not skill, not equipment, just the willingness to ask one more question. to wonder not only what was broken, but how it had gotten that way, to pull the filter, to look under the seat, to sit with the inconsistencies instead of explaining them away. He went inside. Jewel had made lunch. They sat at the kitchen table and ate without the television on, which was unusual for a Saturday, and the snow came down outside the window in the steady, unhurried way that Iowa snow comes when it has decided to stay. They talked about small things, the fence repair Floyd had been putting off, a phone call from their son the previous week, something Jewel had read and wanted to tell him about. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind that would not be remembered for anything specific, the kind that makes up most of a life. In Charles City, about an hour north, a young couple would be unloading a 1984 Kubota L 355 SS into a barn they had been cleaning out for 3 weeks in preparation for exactly this machine. The woman would place a metal lockbox on a shelf near the door where it would be easy to find. She would open it and look at the records inside at 2 different handwritings spanning 35 years, at one small note written in haste on a day when a storm was coming and the hay was not yet in. She would keep every record. She would add her own. Cletus did not know this yet. He could not know it. But he had told her about Corbett Dunning, and she had asked about the box, and she had taken it with both hands. That was enough.